Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Tonight's story, we learn all about a truck driver who has incredible sightings driving his truck at night. So let's get started. Dear Sarah, I was a long-haul truck driver for about 10 years, and believe me, I've seen things on the roads of North America that would make your hair curl. From dreadful fatalities on the road, to car accidents, drunken idiots, strange bystanders, Bigfoots, dogman and ghostly encounters, and the lists of oddities, believe me, goes on and on. Some of my stories defy natural explanation, so if anyone's got some interesting stories to tell you, it's those of us that are on the roads for all those ungodly hours, especially truck drivers that drive during the night hours. It's odd because when anomalous things happen, they do seem to occur between 2:30 to 4 p.m. in the morning. I know of other truckers who have had their own scandalous stories to tell that I am sure will be of interest to your listeners. So I will make sure that they do eventually get in touch, provided of course you can assure them of remaining anonymous. Some of us are terribly afraid to come forward with our stories for fear of being ridiculed, laughed at, or even mocked. Being a long-haul truck driver is an inflexible life because you literally are eating and sleeping in your truck continuously. The only way you make money is if your truck is actually moving. In a day I can travel 600 miles and a week easily about 3,000 and double that if you have a driving partner, which unfortunately I don't. Most of your driving is invariably done on the highway, which does mean that you cannot always just stop to go sightseeing, even when you go through some beautiful, exquisite and captivating areas. I have sometimes flouted that rule from time to time, but most drivers are much more vigilant about the clock than I was. For me personally, the natural world had a huge and still does have a powerful hold over my life, and nothing beats a good view, and even a little light brisk walk in some crisp mountain air. The trouble with being a truck driver is you're literally getting no exercise whatsoever, and living off non-perishable junk food can have a catastrophic effect on your waistline, your blood pressure, your cholesterol, your liver, and then the very increased likelihood of developing diabetes as well. All these inevitable disadvantages of an unavoidable sedentary lifestyle are not pleasant. Some truck stops do have a gym where you can work out, but I promise you when you've been focusing on that road for hours at a time, exercise is the last thing on your mind. After being seated for so long, you do develop these horrible aches and pains all over your body, so all you want to do is to stretch, eat and get some well-needed shut-eye. Having a hot shower is a luxury you can ill afford when you're always on the move, and it's only when you stop at the special piazzas that you can indulge yourself with a good wash, which does mean that showering every day is unlikely. Believe me, driving long distances makes you grimy, sweaty, sticky and mucky, and it just seems to glue itself to you, which is so unpleasant. So I always carry tons of wet wipes with me, sanitizers and dry hair shampoos. When I was trucking, it became my home for about 10 long years, and instead of making do with the sleeper bunks they provide in the back, I purchased myself a decent mattress and a comfy duvet, which makes all the difference, because sleep is crucial when you're driving a truck. You cannot bypass that need for sleep, and it's a rule you can't afford to flout, because believe me, there have been some dreadful accidents on those roads. Some drivers are so desperate to meet their delivery windows and deadlines that they end up driving too fast and recklessly, taking risks that they can ill afford to take, sometimes resulting not necessarily in their own fatality, but in the fatalities of others, which is not a joke. At that time of my life, I was driving shipments for weeks at a time, and when I did actually get to go home, I had to go grocery shopping just to stock up for my next long-haul truck trip, as well as do all my own washing and ironing, so it was hardly long enough to get some real quality time to spend with my family, whom I would miss very much when I was away. My wife had to man the fort and watch over the children every time I was out trucking. Angel was 6 and Paddy was 9 at the time. However, when you need to provide for your family, there rarely are not any options available to you in putting bread on the table, so to speak. So for me, driving a truck was an easy way to bring in a pay package. Truck driving didn't pay well in the beginning, but over the years I did get pay infinitely more, and I did end up getting a sizable salary, because I had a lot of experience under my belt, no accidents on the road, as well as always making my deliveries on time, which all had a huge positive effect on my reputation as a truck driver and my income. Anyway, now that I've given you a rough outline of my lifestyle on the open road, let me get you into some of the strange, really rather bizarre, queer stories that I encountered on those North American roads that I believe are going to baffle and intrigue your listeners. I guess driving through the witching hours on the highways at night does predispose you to strange, somewhat peculiar encounters. Of course, driving at night does have its distinct drawbacks, which include becoming overtired because of the natural biorhythms of your body, as your body is naturally does not adapt to being wide awake at night, and this does impair your attention span and sometimes even induce sleep if you're not careful. Then there is also the reduced visibility on the road and the potential of being exposed to crime, as well as getting a reduced mediocre after-hours service from dispatch, which can be a dreadful drawback. However, there are less obstacles on the roads and much less traffic, so you can get a lot more driving time under your belt, and that is what appealed to me. One night it was about 2:30 p.m, so you can call that early morning, but as far as I'm concerned, it's still night, when everything around you is very dark, apart from the street lights. I had been driving for several hours straight without any obstacles or traffic on the road, and it was very still, and it was a noiseless night, and even though I was in my truck, it did feel particularly heavy. I distinctly remember that. The evening seemed unusually oppressive and rather menacing, despite the pearly moon and the twinkling light of the beautiful silvery stars. Something did feel distinctly off, but I didn't know exactly what it was. Suddenly I saw the sylph-like willowy figure of a very lurid-faced woman in a flowing black dress, standing in the middle of the road, waving me down frantically, as if she desperately needed my help. What the heck, I thought. What is that woman doing in the middle of the road? Is she completely deranged? I slowed down my truck, heaved open the door and climbed out to survey the whole area, but nobody was there. I looked over to my left and to my right, but I was just met with the placidity of the night. But I did get this airy, horrible feeling that I was being watched by a very pugnacious, evil pair of eyes, and it caused the hair on the back of my neck to stand on end. It really felt very ghoulish, and even the trees in the distance were swaying menacingly, only adding to the airy creepiness of that horrible night. I thought it was all really odd, because I had seen the woman so very clearly, and she seemed to just vanish before my eyes. How was that possible, I wondered? Was I overtired and seeing things and imagining things, I asked myself, slipping back into my seat, sighing heavily and muttering to myself under my breath. As I started up the engine and manoeuvred my truck into the middle of the road, meditating on what just had happened, suddenly everything in my truck became freezing cold, so cold that I felt like I was standing in a freezer box. I sensed this incredible evil malaise. I know of no other way to describe it. And then I glanced to the passenger seat, and I saw this big, black, dark, shadowy, cloudy start to take on physical form of its own. And suddenly there was the woman in the passenger seat, who was the one I'd seen in the road, right next to me. I was so terrified, I let out a shrill scream, and the woman gave me this vile, toothless grin. I immediately pulled over to the side of the road and leapt out of my truck as swiftly as I could, not knowing what else I should do. I eventually picked up the courage to peer into my truck, and I was glad to see that the woman had gone. I breathed a huge sigh of relief, hopped back into my truck, and proceeded to drive. And suddenly there she was again, standing in the middle of the road, beckoning to me again. My heart was beating violently in my chest, and my hands became clammy and sweaty, but I drove right through her, and as I did this she let out the most shrill, gut-wrenching scream that sounded like I'd murdered her. I looked through my rear mirror and could see her standing in the middle of the road, oscillating her fists at me angrily. Without a shadow of a doubt, I'd actually seen a ghost that night. Bear in mind that I had never ever believed in the paranormal before, but after this experience I was forced to change my perception about things completely, which was not easy by any means because I am a deeply cynical guy, and until my ghostly encounters I'd pretty much believed that this life was all there was, and there was no hereafter. Now I was forced to re-examine my belief. For a long time I did not share my strange encounter with anyone, until 2 truck drivers I knew, who frequent that highway at night on a regular basis, shared with me a similar rendezvous with a strange woman in black who flagged them down in the middle of the road and vanished before their eyes, only to reappear in their truck moments later. "Whatever you do, just do not stop for her," said the one driver. "I've seen her several times on that stretch of highway, and I drive right through her. And when I do, she screams out in agony, but I just ignore her every time and continue to drive on. I always see her gestating furiously through the rear mirror. No one has any idea what this apparition's story is and why she flags down unsuspecting truck drivers on the highway, but one thing I do know is that the woman is evil, and her intentions are iniquitous. For days after that encounter, there was a very strange sulphurous smell in my truck that just would not go away, no matter how much scrubbing I did. It literally clung to my body, so that wherever I went, people would look at me and say, "What's that ghastly smell?" knowing that the smell was emanating from me, and it did smell like a rotting corpse. Truly, I tried to avoid people for a while, because everywhere I went, people would wrinkle their nose and whisper behind my back that I smelt like a skunk. That must have lasted for about 3 days or so, and I've never been so self-conscious in my entire life. I could hardly say, "Excuse me, it's not me that smells, but a vile witch that I picked up on the highway." Another ghostly encounter happened on the highway. It was in the middle of the night, and someone was standing on the side of the road, trying to wave me down. I normally do not stop for hitchhikers, and after that incident with the woman in black, I was certainly not eager to pick up any bystanders. However, there was something about this guy that was non-threatening and desperate, so I pulled over to the side of the road and offered him a lift, which I will tell you is something I am not inclined to usually do, even at the best of times. So I have no idea what induced me to stop for him at all, but I did, and that's where my story begins. When he got into my truck, I noticed the clothes he was wearing looked like he was from the 1800s, as he was wearing long pants with a long white button shirt and braces, but I thought that he was a little eccentric, or maybe he could be Amish. He had a strong southern drawl and a very nice warm manner about him. I asked him what he was doing on the highway in the middle of the night. He said he needed to get help, as his farmhouse was ablaze and his daughter and wife were caught up in the fire. I asked him if he had phoned 999, and he said that help was coming with the horses and with Mr. Finley. I thought it was very odd, because what was he doing in my truck if his farmhouse was ablaze? Surely he should be waiting for help and not taking a ride with me on the highway in the middle of the night. It really didn't make any sense to me. I was just about to cross-examine him on all this, when suddenly he asked me to stop. "Stop! Stop!" At last he said, "There's Mr. Finley with the horses." I stopped the truck, Rubbing my eyes in total disbelief, there in the middle of the road were two magnificent black horses pulling a buggy with a rider dressed in black with a large top hat holding the reins. I could not believe what I was seeing, but I promise you with all my heart it was as real as you and I, and it looked like I was watching a clip from another time. I watched the man get into the buggy. The horses made that sound that they often make, and I heard the reins being flicked by the driver and the sounds of the horses' hooves trotting away. But everything faded from my sight by getting dimmer and dimmer until it just vanished. It was rather like that. I knew immediately that I'd seen another ghostly apparition, which was so bizarre. Whether it was a time lapse in our reality or a glitch in the fabric of time, I do not know, but I promise you it was real, and it truly did happen. One night I was driving, and I suddenly felt this fogginess creep over me. This does happen from time to time, and it's a warning sign. I knew at once that I was falling asleep at the wheel, and would have to pull over from the road for a while to have a little shut-eye. If I didn't, I would definitely have an accident. So I had to listen to my body. I would regret it, and I was so frustrated. You know that feeling when you're too busy to eat, but your hunger has other ideas and stops you in your tracks, when you just want to focus on what you're doing? It was just like that. I pulled off to the side of the road and parked my truck. I then went to my bed in the back to get some sleep. I was awoken a couple of hours later to these huge slapping sounds on the side of my truck, and the very clear sound of something being dragged on the ground. I got up immediately to see what was going on. I was very sleepy and still in a state of sleepiness. I used my flashlight to get a better view, but I saw absolutely nothing. There was a loud clamming sound as if someone was getting on top of my container. I was sure I heard something walking over the shipping container, and it sounded like a herd of rhinos that had been let loose. I was terrified, but then the noise seemed to stop as suddenly as it had started, and everything became incredibly quiet. So then I told myself that it was nothing to worry about, and I returned to bed, puzzled about what had happened, but frankly way too tired to really very much care. I woke up at about 5 o'clock that morning, and it was getting significantly lighter outside, but I did take a flashlight as I needed to relieve myself, and then as I was coming back from my ablutions, I saw something that looked like a massive shaggy coat on the top of my shipping container. My first reaction was, what the heck is that? It looked like someone had offloaded tons of their dirty fur coats that they no longer wanted, and were too lazy to take to the dumpster, so they had thrown them in a mangled heap on top of my truck. As I got closer to my container, I heard this loud snoring sound, and I realized that this huge fleecy coat on my truck was in fact a living creature of some kind, and whatever it was that was sleeping on top of my container, it was massive. I also noticed a few bloody stains on the side of my truck that looked like drag marks. Whatever this creature was, it was injured, and it must have been the very thing that I'd heard during the night clamouring on my container, making all that huge commotion and those horrible slapping sounds. I could detect a very offensive smell in the air that smelt really rank and rough, like stale urine, perspiration and cheesy trainers. I decided to get back into my truck, and I just hoped that whatever it would move off on its own account. I did not want to deal with it, whatever it was. I had no desire to tackle it, and so I decided to proceed with my journey and pretend that I hadn't actually seen it. I drove straight for about 6 hours solid, and then I pulled over to the side of the road to relieve myself once again behind a large tree that I had spotted. Another unfortunate side effect of being a trucker. I looked towards the top of my shipping container to see if that fleecy creature was still there, and then I saw it moving, and suddenly it rose up on its two hind legs. The creature was bipedal and was colossal, and was about 8 feet tall, 700 pounds, and 4.5 feet wide. It had the most enormous shoulders and a very distinctive cone-shaped head. It was covered from head to toe with long silvery grey hair, and I realised immediately I was seeing an elderly Bigfoot who had injured his foot very badly. I could see him dragging the foot on the top of the container, and I heard him make a few painful grunts, as if his foot was giving him a whole lot of pain. He stood erect on the container like an imposing, statuesque monster. I watched the Bigfoot study the view from the motorway that stretched back into the vast area of natural forest. He seemed to be getting his coordinates and bearings sorted in his head, judging by the way he was studying the terrain and the landscape, and then he seemed satisfied that he knew where he was, and he bounced off the container with the agility of a domestic cat, making sure not to land on his injured foot. I watched him jump over a huge guardrail as if it was nothing, walk through a clearing, down an embankment, towards a wood full of pine trees, and then he disappeared and was gone. He moved with a flawless fluidity, despite the impediment of his injured foot, which he dragged behind him precariously. I watched in awe and stunned amazement to realize that the creature had clearly hitchhiked to lift with me on the back of my shipping container. I marveled at the intelligence of this humanoid ape-like creature for thinking outside the box to get to a different location faster, as I imagined his injured foot was holding him back. I imagine these creatures are like nomads, moving from one place to another, following waterways or electric pylons. That's my guess. I was amazed to realize that the Bigfoot was so real and not the legendary creature I had believed him to normally be. Not once during my observation of this strange creature did I feel any fear, but all I felt was awe and admiration for this lofty, majestic creature that had crossed my path in such an unusual and spectacular way. Another time I was driving on the highway, and these huge balls of light that looked like orbs literally went wheeling past my car towards the cemetery. I literally parked my truck on the side of the road to follow the orbs of light. It was like watching a swarm of butterflies winging off, and it was so beautiful to watch. The light orbs seemed insightful, and so I watched them pirouetting around the graves, and then they all flew into this huge mausoleum. But when I physically saw the mausoleum door open very, very slowly, all on its own, and a shadowy form walking out of it, looking directly in my direction, I immediately hightailed it back to my truck and started the engine up as quickly as I could, scolding myself vehemently for being too curious for my own good. As I started up my engine, I felt this cold air blowing across my face, and then I drove down the middle of the highway and saw the most terrifying creature that I've ever seen in my entire life, standing there in the middle of the road with an agog look on his face. I say that because it felt like he was waiting for me. The creature looked like a huge, black, dangerous dog, and he was standing up on two legs and walking around on them as naturally as a human being. He had the most ghastly, ferocious red eyes that I have ever seen, and his eyes locked into mine, and I felt the most atrocious chill engulf my entire body, like I was standing in sub-zero conditions. This critter was evil, and I could sense and feel it in every fibre of my being. It was colossal for a dog, at about 400 pounds, with a massive dog-like head and very sharp canine teeth, but it stood on two legs like a human. The creature was roaring, growling and snarling at me simultaneously, and then it actually pounced on my windscreen and was scratching the glass with his talons, as if he was finding a way to get into my vehicle, to tear me apart. I am in no doubt that that is what he wanted to do. I am not ashamed to admit that I was terrified for my very life, and I know if he had got into my truck, he would definitely have killed me. I was so terrified my heart was pounding through my chest, and I let out a shrill scream. Suddenly I saw the light orbs again coming back from that graveyard, and then that wolf-like creature, whatever he was, appeared to follow those lights, and then they all vanished together. I was hyperventilating so much. I've never been so terrified in my entire life, and have no idea what that creature actually was, nor what on earth those orbs were. But one thing I can tell you is that it was very, very evil. After those nightly encounters on the road, I chose to opt for some day driving. I am no longer a trucker, but for all you skeptics out there, I want to assure you there are things out there that defy natural understanding. Some are good, and others are evil. But that is my story. I could tell you a lot more about some of the bizarre encounters I encountered as a trucker, but those are the most amazing. Dear Sarah and all your listeners, I grew up in a tiny little apartment block in New York in the early 80s, and I was raised by my single mother, who was sadly estranged from her only living family member, a sister called Emma. She told me that when she was a young girl, she was very much in love with Robert, the boy that she'd been dating for over 3 long years, who was now, believe it or not, my uncle. One day, Robert and her sister Emma started to see each other in secret behind my mother's back. My mother was left with her heart totally broken, seemingly betrayed by the 2 people that she had loved and trusted more than anybody else in the world. Emma, her sister, was now married to Robert, and they lived in Michigan, and that was all I actually knew. As you can imagine, after my mother found out about her sister's horrible betrayal, she was utterly mortified, and she moved away and settled far away in New York, away from her family home in Michigan. She chose to cut off all ties with her sister Emma, who she had not spoken to for years. I was born a month or 2 after my mother arrived in New York. My mother never told me who my father was. I didn't ask either, because every time I brought up the subject, I could see that dire, sad despondency in her eyes, and she would look at me and say, "Pete, I'd rather not talk about that if you don't mind. It hurts too much." My mother worked during the day as a secretarial assistant for a local kitchen company, and money was always tight, because living in New York, even in those days, was never cheap, and the rent for our sizable apartment consumed much of my mother's income. My mother never dated again, because I think she'd lost total faith in humanity, and I was the only person in the world that she allowed into her heart, and she loved the bones off me. I truly became her world, and as far as she was concerned, nothing outside me actually mattered. One day I came home from school and I put my satchel on the counter and I called out, "Mum! Mum, are you there?" I could suddenly hear all this whispering going on in the kitchen, and then I very distinctly heard a male voice saying, "I'll deal with this, all right?" My heart started to thump violently in my chest because I sensed something was erroneously wrong. Then I saw a policeman coming through the kitchen door and beckoning for me to sit down on my mother's cosy couch. My face went as white as a sheet, and I said, "Please, sir, where is my mother?" I was to learn that my mother had tragically died of a brain aneurysm at work while she was taking an order for a client for a kitchen product. I gather she was talking 1 minute and then gone the next. So if anything, I'm very glad that she did not suffer and that her demise was very quick. In that instant, as you can imagine, my life changed very dramatically. Gone was my safe, secure life with my mother in a New York apartment, and I was immediately taken to live with a foster family with 10 other needy, very demanding foster kids, and my whole world just came crumbling down, shattering into thousands of pieces. I had never experienced the horrific emptiness of grief that I did now. I was absolutely devastated. I remember feeling so alone and all alone and lost in the world. I was told that I was going to live with Robert, my uncle, my Aunt Emma, and their son Timothy, who had chosen to adopt me as their child, and I was devastated, as you can imagine, by this revelation, because it would be like living with my sworn enemies. Unfortunately, the decision was not mine to make. The following day at about 8 a.m., I was driven from New York to Michigan, which took about 10.5 hours, and I arrived at my uncle's Michigan rather grand-looking farmhouse at about 7 p.m. It was all incredibly overwhelming. I was determined to hate them with every fibre of my being, but the moment I saw Emma, she reminded me so much of my mother, and when she cradled me in her loving arms, I just sobbed, and so did she. She kept saying to me, "I'm so sorry for all the dreadful hurt I've caused." I knew that her apology extended way beyond my mother's death, and so in that moment I chose to exonerate her from the hurt that she had caused my mother. It was when I met my cousin Timothy, I nearly did a double take. I could hardly believe that I was seeing myself in the mirror. That was what it was like. He looked exactly like me, and we were only a couple of months apart in age. It was like I was staring at my twin brother, and from that moment we were inseparable, because we had similar interests and we had so much in common. My Uncle Rob wasted no time in ushering me into his office moments after I'd arrived. "I see no point in beating around the bush," he said, "so I'm going to say it as it is. I am your father." I was absolutely dumbfounded. "Are you sure?" I asked. "My mother never told me who my father was." "I am absolutely certain," he said, looking at me kindly and taking me lovingly into his arms in a warm, tender embrace. "I suspected you were mine, so I ran a DNA test on your hair that your foster mother removed from your hairbrush, very, very sneakily, I'm afraid. I just needed to see if you were mine to be sure. And you are, I'm very delighted to say." "Why did you cheat on my mother?" I said. "You really broke her heart. She loved you so much." I could see my father fighting back tears in his eyes. "I was younger then," he said, "foolish and easily flattered by Emma's advances. Now don't get me wrong, I love your Aunt Emma very much indeed. But your mother, she was the love of my life. I really blew it with her. I'm so sorry. And if I'd known she was pregnant with you, I would have fought a lot harder. She could not forgive me or Emma for my betrayal. And how can I blame her?" "Yes, but why did you do it in the first place?" I persisted. "You must have known it was wrong." "Oh, I did. I was young, that's all I can say. I'm not excusing my atrocious behaviour. I was just so easily led astray. I was young, with a very big ego. It had a lot to do with it, I'm afraid." I have to tell you, knowing that my mother had been the love of his life really made me so happy, and the animosity and hatred I felt towards my uncle and aunt soon dissipated, never to be remembered again. Fast forward a few months, and I was settled down into my beautiful country home in Michigan. My father lived on 250 acres of pristine land that was surrounded by some grazing pastures for his horses and extensive areas of tillable timber. A very large, picturesque silvery lake, a stunning lily-covered pond, along with various sheds and outbuildings. The rolling pastures of horizontal emerald green grass were relatively flat and uniform, but on the eastern side of the valley, next to an extensive wooded area that stretched back for miles, was an enormous hillock that I could not wait to use for tobogganing when winter came. Timothy, my brother, and I became as thick as thieves, and we would do absolutely everything together. I have to say I was beginning to love and adore life in the countryside. I loved the wide open spaces, the prepossessing views, the habitual wildlife from the deer to the rabbits, and the crisp country air. Emma and my father teased me as if I was their own son, and my father taught me everything I know today, from hunting to tracking to fishing. One day when winter had arrived, and the whole area was covered and carpeted in thick veils of white glistening snow, resembling an idyllic winter wonderland, Tim and I raced out into the snow with our toboggans, squandering no time at all to go riding down the huge hilly embankment. We were having so much fun, laughing and joking and riding up and down the high hill and screaming in delight, when I suddenly got the distinct impression that I was being watched. I did not want the person who was ogling me to know that I had seen them or sensed them, so I positioned my body in such a way as to get a good view of the individual through my peripheral vision, without them actually knowing. I could not believe what my eyes were actually seeing. Scrutinizing us with intense curiosity was a hairy humanoid ape that was at a guess at the very least about 8 to 9 feet tall. This creature looked just like a black bear, but his physical stature and his face were distinctly human-like. "We are being watched," I whispered to Tim, "but don't look." Tim continued to toboggan down the slope, but he was always trying to get a glimpse of the stranger without them knowing that we'd actually seen them. "What the heck is that?" he whispered to me as he climbed the toboggan to slide down the hill all over again. "I have no idea," I said, "but it's definitely not a bear, And it's not human either. The mystery creature, whatever he was, seemed to really enjoy watching us and what we were doing. He was intrigued, fascinated, and interested in us. But little did he know that we were secretly equally as curious and interested in him. Bear in mind, this was in the 80s, and we had no clue what this creature could possibly be. Once the hairy critter had turned around to walk away, Tim and I crept up to the hill and lay flat on the snow, watching the animal moving gracefully towards the woods on his long, agile thighs that manoeuvred across the snow seamlessly, almost as if he was wearing snowshoes, and he moved his arms backwards and forwards, almost as if he was marching. "What the heck?" said Tim again. "What the heck is that?" "Let's follow his trail," I said, "and find out where he lives. We could spy on him." Tim thought it sounded like a marvellous idea. He was equally as curious and fascinated by the creature as I was. "Come," I prodded. "Let's go." "Look at this," said Tim, looking in horror at the large footprint in the snow. The foot impression was, I kid you not, at least 17 inches long and 10 inches wide. We both placed our tiny feet in the imprint, and they were swamped by the huge size of this foot impression that made our feet look minute by comparison. We could hear Emma calling us for lunch, but we weren't interested in food at all. Our hunger had been overtaken by an insatiable curiosity to follow this incredible creature, and that's exactly what we did. The creature's strides were utterly enormous. One of his footsteps was equivalent to 5 of our feet. We were flabbergasted. We followed the large trail of footprints into the sylvan area, and as they were so fresh, they were exceedingly easy to follow. Everything in the woods was quiet, made more still by the falling heavy snow. It was easy to spot the creature in this weather, because he was so black against the white snow. "There he is," I whispered to Tim. "Over there, see?" He was standing in an open clearing in the woods. We hid behind the girth of a very old tree trunk that provided an excellent hiding space to observe the creature closely, who was clearly oblivious to our presence. He was much larger than I'd actually imagined on closer inspection. We were much closer to him now, and I would say that he was about 1,000 pounds in weight and between 9 to 10 feet tall, not 8 to 9 as I had previously thought, and he was easily 5 feet wide. I was so impressed with this creature's torso because it was ripped and exceedingly muscular, and his arms were uncommonly long. He had a bullet-shaped head that flowed seamlessly onto a very wide pair of shoulders. I could see the creature had a dark, hairless face, flat nose, brown, sparkly, rusty-coloured eyes, but I could not see those details as clearly as I would have liked. The creature was dragging stones away, and I guessed he was looking for a hibernating squirrel. Some of the stones he moved were rarely big, and it was effortless for him to lift them up in his arms. Soon he found what he was looking for, and he literally snapped the squirrel's neck in an instant. I truly think the squirrel would not have felt a thing, because its demise was so quick and merciful, and besides, it was probably half asleep. The hairy humanoid replaced the stones to where they originally stood, and started to play with the dead squirrel, as if it was a ball. He would throw it up into the air until it glided a fair way away, and then he would catch it. His movements were so agile and fast and athletic, and he never missed catching the squirrel once. I knew of no human that could do this, and I was so impressed. I just kept thinking to myself that I wished he was on our football team at school, because we would win every time against all our competitors. "See how he moves," marvelled Tim. "Have you ever seen anything that can move like that?" "It's incredible," I agreed. "But more to the point," I said, "what on earth is he? I never knew a creature like this existed." "I think there's definitely some great ape in him," said Tim. "Look at his lengthy arms and his conical face. He looks distinctly like an ape." We stood there spellbound, watching the creature in awe and disbelief, because we'd never heard of any documented accounts of a creature that looked exactly like this. The creature finally squatted down on a large boulder in the clearing, and we watched him tear open the squirrel and eat it like we would munch a hot dog. He sat there just chewing, and hurled the carcass of the squirrel on the ground once he'd finished. He then got up, and to our amusement he started to whistle to himself, and he sounded exactly like a songbird that I'd often heard in the woods when we were hunting. "We better get back," I whispered, "because your mother will be sending out a search party by now. We can return again after lunch, and we'll see if he's still here." "Where have you boys been?" snapped Emma as we bolted down our cold spaghetti bologneses like ravenous Labradors. "Emma," I asked, "do you know anything about apes?" "What a very extraordinary question," asked Emma. "You're a lot like your mother, Pete, asking all these odd things all the time. Your mother was like that. What do you want to know exactly?" "Well, what do they eat apart from meat?" "What makes you think they eat meat?" asked Emma in surprise. "As far as I know, they like fruit. Well, that's what they feed them at the zoos anyway. Although I have heard that those monkeys you get in India will eat anything. Apparently they eat crisps and popcorns from the tourists in those places. Is there a possibility of an ape living here in Michigan?" My aunt hooted with laughter. "Tim, where did I find you?" "No," she giggled. "There are no primates in America. With an exception to the zoos, of course. If I take you to the zoo, you'll see one there." That afternoon, when Emma wasn't looking, we raided her pantry and her fruit bowls. We took bananas, apples, crisps, raisins, dates, peanuts, walnuts, raspberry jam, salted crisps, shortbread biscuits, and we went back to where we'd seen the humanoid ape. And sadly, he wasn't anywhere in the rocky clearing. We were somewhat disheartened, but we decided to hide the food stash under some of the rocks he had initially removed to look for that hibernating squirrel. We knew he would be coming back any time soon, perhaps for another squirrel, and then he would discover our secret food stash. At least that's what we hoped. We stayed hidden behind the girth of a large tree for about 3 hours, and were about to give up and to leave, when suddenly we heard the creature coming back, and there he was, larger than life. Once again the creature pushed away some heavy stones to look for yet again another squirrel. I guess he must have been hungry again. We watched him lifting up the stones, and then he came across our stash of food. The expression on his face was absolutely priceless. He looked so puzzled, as if he couldn't understand where the magic leaf the food had materialized from. He lifted all the rocks just to check he had not missed anything, and then he sat on the ground with all the goodies, looking as pleased as Punch, almost as if he'd just won the lottery. He started to shake the shortbread biscuits container curiously, examining the package closely with a look of awe on his face, and pulling away the cellophane. He then smelt the biscuit, examining it very carefully, and then taking a bite. And he seemed to be enjoying the taste because he kept smacking his lips together. Suddenly he looked very alert, just like a dog does when they're sure they've heard something. At that moment the creature looked terribly, terribly concerned. He then quickly hid all the goodies under the stone, just as another big creature appeared. I guessed it must have been its partner, because it was smaller than him, and it had furry breasts. He started chattering to the creature, and pointed to some stones far away from his food stash that we had given him, and he had surreptitiously hidden. He then chattered very excitedly, lifting up the rocks further away from the hidden food stash, and then he found another hibernating squirrel, which he killed instantly, handing it to the female while she squatted down to eat it. All the while he was doing this, he kept looking towards our hidden food stash with a look of very deep concern on his face. We both realized in amusement that this stash of food he had absolutely no intention of sharing with the female. Tim and I were giggling so much because it was so funny to watch. Once the female had eaten her squirrel and sauntered off, the creature went back to the hidden food stack just to make sure it was still there and had not magically just vanished. As he did this, he looked around cautiously, to the left, to the right, to the front, and to the back, to check that nobody was coming. And then he quickly rearranged some of the rocks over the food stash to make doubly sure that everything was very well hidden. He then ambled away with a look of very deep satisfaction on his face. That was the only time on the Michigan farm that we had such a close encounter with that beautiful creature that I now realise was actually a Bigfoot, a Sasquatch or a Yeti. One day when I was 21 years old, my brother Tim brought this beautiful girl home whom he had been dating. I knew that I would never do to my brother what my mother's sister had done to my mother, no matter how great the temptation. I am so glad I respected those boundaries, as Tim married the girl many years later. It was through Tim that I was to meet my wife Kate, who was her best friend, and it was quite literally love at first sight for both of us. So we married and had 3 children together. I still live in the Michigan area on 300 acres of land with 2 farmhouses, one that belongs to me and the other to my brother. All these years later, we are still exceptionally close and still looking for another amazing encounter with the elusive beast that we call Bigfoot. So here is still hoping. Now, we all know about long-haul truck drivers, and I've just only recently launched one of my truck drivers and his incredible encounters on the road. And he has a friend who's also given an incredible account of his experiences on our North American highways at night. And this guy has been driving a truck for over 30 years, so he's got lots of stories to tell. And believe me, this is only the beginning, so I know you're going to enjoy the story he has for us tonight, which is literally going to knock your socks off. So let's get started. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, I'm writing to you as I was recently encouraged by my trucking friend to do so. I believe he recently shared with you and your listeners his utterly extraordinary accounts of some of the bizarre encounters that he experienced driving on the North American roads in his long-haul truck at those ungodly hours of the night. Like him, I have had some harrowing experiences all of my own whilst driving on our North American highways at the dead of night in the witching hours. I'm eager to share with you and your listeners my incredible stories that border from the incredulous to the bizarre. It does feel good to unload some of my strange encounters with you and your listeners of my outer-worldly phenomenon experiences, to try and make some kind of sense out of them. I assure you, my stories are true, regardless of how fictitious they may actually sound. All these years later, meditating on these peculiar out-of-worldly events has left me with more questions than answers concerning the nature of our reality and how things actually do work in this very strange, peculiar world of ours. And I wish that I could have answers for you, but I don't. Before I became a long-haul truck driver, I was a deeply cynical person that would have laughed in your face if you had tried to convince me that spurious cryptid-like creatures like Bigfoot and Dogman were in fact real. I would have believed you to be as nutty as a fruitcake, completely off your rocker, or just plain old barking mad. Now it seems that I am the one with egg on my face. As far as the paranormal and ghostly encounters are concerned, I also believe them not to be credible or reliable, and much more like fabricated, feigned stories designed to give us the heebie-jeebies with no real solid foundation or truth behind them. I was soon to discover how wrong I actually was, and how intrinsically real some of these peculiar things that happen actually are. Believe me, there is stuff that is occurring at the dead of night that would make your blood run cold, if you were unfortunate enough to happen to witness them with your own eyes, like I have. I gather my trucker friend did inform you about the lifestyle of a long-haul truck driver, because believe me, it's not plain sailing as it may appear. It's not a job for the faint-hearted by any means, because believe me, it gets lonely out on those open roads at night, and it is tough being away from your family for a very long period of time. Most of us take the job as fast, easy money being our primary motivation, but easy it most certainly is not. As for the money, it is a journey, because when you first start, the pay's not always great, but with more experience under your belt, you can begin to dictate your price, especially when you get well known in the industry, and I've been truck driving for 30 years, so I've got a name, believe me. It's truly tough out there, and if it weren't undemanding, there would not be so many people leaving the industry as they invariably do. nor would there be such a huge demand for gainful employment in the long-haul trucking industry. As a trucker, you literally eat and sleep on the open road, and you do travel through some spectacularly idyllic countryside that is exquisitely beautiful, but you do not get the prerogative or the privilege to traverse and indulge yourself in exploring this natural, glorious world, because you are quite literally stuck behind the driver's seat, and it is utterly imperative for you to meet your critical delivery windows. I personally have suffered from insomnia my entire life, so driving at night has never been a stumbling block for me, as I guess my biorhythms are completely screwed up. I used to visit sleep clinic after sleep clinic after sleep clinic to investigate my peculiar sleeping dilemma, but now I use my restlessness to my advantage by driving at night, and it works incredibly well for me. Driving at night does reduce visibility on the roads monumentally, because it's dramatically compounded when you're dealing with treacherous wintry conditions on the roads, especially fog, hail, rain, sleet, snow and ice. However, there is one huge advantage, which is a game changer as far as I'm concerned, and that is traffic congestion. It literally becomes extinct, and so you can get so many more hours under your belt in a lot less time without stressing yourself out in the process due to obstacles in the road, hold-ups and difficult people, and that is a huge deal to me. So you're probably wondering what I've actually seen on those open roads at night, and believe me, I've seen it all. I've seen Bigfoots, dogmans, and I've seen very odd, peculiar behaved human beings. I've also seen ghosts, apparitions, and UFOs. Yes, I've seen pretty much everything out there. So let me share a few of my astonishing stories with you that I know will blow your socks off. One night I was driving out on the open road. I think it was about 1 o'clock. I was listening to Reba McEntire, my all-time favourite country singer. I simply adore her. I was listening to her song, If You See Him, and I was singing the song with her and literally banging my hand in time to the music on my steering wheel, something that I'm prone to doing when I'm enjoying the music. Quite suddenly, out of the blue, I saw a white Mitsubishi car come flying out of nowhere, and it literally went rolling, somersaulting and pirouetting in circles, only yards away from my truck. I could hardly believe what I was actually witnessing, and it was happening so quickly. I immediately braked, only feet away from the horrifying collision. I watched the car ploughing through the guardrail, where luckily it suddenly just stopped, precariously hanging over the embankment. Thankfully, it did not go rolling down the vast grassy ridge. However, the forceful impact literally thrust, crumpled and buckled about 2 feet of the metal bonnet inwards, spawning the windshield to implode violently and spraying the inside of the car with deadly slivers of glass. I could see that both the steering wheel and the dashboard were mangled and obliterated in a massive mess, and the person behind the steering wheel seemed to be in a very critical condition, and maybe even deceased. I could smell that disgusting lingering scent of smoke and see the dark, ominous smoky fumes filling the car. And even in my truck, I literally could taste that oily residue in my mouth. I knew I had only seconds to literally save this person's life, if they indeed could be saved. Judging by the state of the car, it was exceedingly doubtful. Suddenly, before I even opened my truck door, out of the dark shadows of the night, like a shining knight in shining armour, and rising up from the grassy embankment and stepping seamlessly over the guardrail, was this colossal blue-grey giant, covered in shaggy hair from head to toe, that stood on 2 feet. He was easily over 1,000 pounds and 10 to 11 foot tall. This imposing creature was quite literally humongous in his stature, girth, strength and grace. Never before in my entire life had I ever witnessed such a majestic, magnificent, lofty and powerful creature. In that moment, I realised that this creature was definitely a Bigfoot. and I sat back in my truck, transfixed, spellbound and astounded by what I was actually seeing. This incredible Bigfoot was trying to rescue the dying man in his car. I watched him make light work of the mangled wreck of the car and stabilizing it. The car looked literally like a kid's toy in his Goliath-like arms and sausage-sized fingers. He steered the car away from the guardrail, propelling it forwards with his humongous arms. He pulled the buckled car door off its hinges with one huge thrust and with effortless ease. Something that you would have to do with the jaws of life in normal situations. The defunct man lay limp in the road, and the jumbo-sized humanoid ape tried to revive him by shaking him a little and slapping his face, but the man did not respond to his valiant efforts. It was clear that the man had died on impact. Suddenly the disheartened, hairy humanoid looked up at me. I think he could detect and actually feel my stares. He knew I had been watching him. In that moment our eyes met, and I sensed his disappointment and dismay in the creature's gaze. It was like in that moment we were both united in the depredation of this terrible tragedy that had unfolded before our eyes, and we were both sharing in our grief for this senseless, tragic loss. I immediately phoned 911 and reported the accident, giving them all my information should they require any further details. I didn't want to stay around because I could see the telltale flickers of yellow flames, and I knew that within seconds that car would burst and explode into a fiery inferno, and I didn't want to be around for that. I watched the Bigfoot gliding down the embankment with incredible grace and majesty, and then I manoeuvred my truck out of the area as fast as was conceivably possible. I remember my heart was thumping violently in my chest, and I became overwhelmed with turbulent, tempestuous emotions. I was thinking of that poor man's family and how it was that he had managed to crash his car so destructively, ending in such tragic consequences. I immediately pulled my pickup to the side of the road to gather my composure and to take stock of things and to get some deep breaths into my lungs. Suddenly I realized I was not alone, and imagine my surprise when I recognized the ghostly form sitting next to me in my truck. I was too amazed to be afraid, because I knew that this man sitting next to me was a deceased man that I had just seen lying dead on the road only moments before. The man looked befuddled and unhinged, but he was definitely a ghost, because he had a translucency about him that is the only way I can describe it. I knew he needed my help, so I said to him, "Look, buddy, I do not know your name, but you have just had a catastrophe. You've had a dreadful car accident, and you died on impact. It must be hard to deal with, I know, but you are actually dead. So my advice to you is to look for the light and move towards it. You must embrace the next step of your adventure. I have heard that it is a better place than this one is." The man's expression visibly changed, and he looked at his translucent arms for a moment, as if it had suddenly hit him like a ton of bricks, that he was actually dead. I then heard this energetic whooshing suction sound, and he was gone out of my truck, just like that, never to be seen again. I want to tell you that this whole experience changed my life in an instant, making me realize that we simply do not die, and that energy always lives on. I also realized that Bigfoot was indeed a real flesh and blood being that is remarkably intelligent, perceptive, intuitive, and very, very clever. And that was a divulgence that was hard for me to come to terms with. Another strange experience I had while trucking was at about 2 a.m. in the morning. I began to see this emaciated, atrophied figure of a man hobbling across the road. He was wearing a hospital gown, and he was so stick-thin it was almost impossible to believe that in his wasted state that he actually had the capacity to walk. His eyes were like sunken bony hollows, and his face looked like yellow leather. I immediately braked my truck and asked the man if he needed a lift. I thought he might be someone who'd lost his mental faculties and had wandered away from an old age home, forgetting who or where he was, because believe me, I've seen that before. He nodded his head and followed me to the truck, and seemingly bounced on the seat with a degree of agility that surprised me. "Can I phone someone for you?" I asked, "and let them know where you are? I'm sure your family is very worried about you. It's very late. They must be deeply concerned." The man chuckled as if he found my words amusing. "You can give me a lift if you don't mind," he said. "Of course," I said, surprised that he seemed so lucid and coherent. "I've been a very sick man for a long time," he told me. "I buggered up my liver drinking too much moonshine. The doctor could do nothing for me apart from waiting on my liver transplant, but that was never going to happen. Not for an old codger like me, anyway. They don't have much sympathy for drunks." "So you decided to up and leave the hospital just like that?" I said, looking at him aghast. "That's a very silly thing to do. You could get yourself into serious trouble. You're not a well man." "I ought to take you back right now," I said. "I did notice you were wearing a hospital gown. Which hospital did you come from?" The old man chuckled. "Not so fast," he said. "I'll give you directions myself." I followed the man's directions diligently, and before I knew it, my truck was parked literally outside a cemetery. I could hardly believe it. "Is this some kind of a sick joke?" I asked the man. The man gave me a grin. "I'm at home," he said. "Right over there at plot number 578. I watched the man get out of my truck and wobble precariously on his frail legs towards the graveyard, and then he dematerialized before my eyes. I put a note on plot number 578, which I taped down with the duct tape, asking the grievers of this plot to give me a call, because I knew that I had just seen this man's ghost. A few days later I got a phone call from the daughter, who told me that her father had indeed died of liver disease in hospital 5 days earlier, and she sent me a photograph of him on her mobile phone. Imagine my shock and horror when I saw it was the man I had picked up in my truck, only in this picture he looked remarkably more healthy. I was utterly amazed. I mean, how does this sort of thing ever happen, I wondered. I've also had many other terrifying encounters on those North American roads. One that springs to mind happened in the early hours of the morning at about 3 p.m. on one of our highways. I remember seeing 3 a.m. on one of our highways. I remember seeing what appeared to be a pile of coal-black clothes lying in the middle of the road. I immediately stopped my truck. You see, I sensed something felt incredibly off, and I knew something was not quite right. I also definitely felt evil in the air. The clothes appeared to be smoking, and I could physically see the vapour spiralling out of the material like a white cigarette smoke. The clothes started to whirl and spin in a triangular shape like a spinning wheel, and then the smoky form began to slowly morph into the shape of a hideous, decrepit, sinister, deformed-looking old hag with these massive bulging eyes that were practically bursting out of their sockets as she glared and glowered at me with this horrifying evil stare that physically caused my body to become overwhelmed with an insidious terror. This hag was beyond evil. I do not believe I have ever been so petrified in my entire life. I let out a shrill scream, and I pressed down my accelerator and proceeded to spur my truck down the highway as fast as I possibly could. But as I glanced at my side window, the ugly old hag was glaring at me with her milky eyes, and all the while making these horrifying wailing sounds, and she was scratching the side of my truck with her long talons. I could hear her literally scraping it. I kept driving, seeing her gnarled, distorted, shadowy dark form in my peripheral vision. She literally floated on the side of my truck for a good 15 minutes, all the while making these god-awful shrieks and hissing sounds. I've never seen such a grotesque, ugly, mangled, freakish-looking old hag in my entire life, and hope to never see her again. Suddenly I saw what looked like a large piece of black material blowing in the wind, and then descending towards the middle of the road. I could see the ominous smoky vapour rising from the black material all over again, and I just did not wait. I literally hightailed my truck out of the area as fast as I possibly could, hardly daring to believe what I'd actually seen. I can assure you that the menacing, hag-like woman was exceedingly evil. I was in no doubt about that. I assure you that the side of my truck was seriously damaged, with long scratch marks done in threes. Another thing that was also decidedly odd was that after my encounter with that hideous, vile hag, my mattress in my truck was literally moving and twisting and shaking, and I pulled back the covers to find hundreds of snakes wiggling around my bed sheets, and I'm talking about hundreds of them. I am in no doubt that the hideous hag had something to do with putting them there, but as I'm terrified of snakes, I got someone else to get rid of them. I was told that some of them were deadly. I have experienced other crazy encounters on the roads because I've been driving a long-haul truck for over 30 long years now. I hope your listeners enjoyed my story. Tonight's story is definitely going to pull at your heartstrings because we know that Bigfoots can be very aggressive and very dangerous, but we also do know of people that have had the most phenomenal encounters with Bigfoots, where Bigfoots have not only rescued them from tragic disasters, but also where Bigfoots have transformed and changed their lives. And this story is no exception to that. We all know how the 9/11 disaster really impacted each and every one of us, whether we were alive at the time or not. It clearly left its indelible mark on our lives. And this woman, her story is no different. So I think it's going to really touch your heart because she tells us how she gets through the 9/11 disaster because of a Bigfoot. So let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your listeners, I ask that I may remain anonymous in this story because I don't want my details going public, if you don't mind. I have an extraordinary Bigfoot encounter to share with you and your listeners that brought me so much joy and hope amidst the deep, dark sadness that engulfed and cloaked my life like a black, oppressive cloud for a very long time. This ugly darkness was so pervasive that it literally sucked the marrow from my bones and all the hope in my heart like a ravenous vampire bat. If it had not been for my encounter with a hairy humanoid that many like to call Bigfoot, I truly do not think that I would have pulled through my harrowing, horrendous ordeal. It was Bigfoot that brought a bright sparkle into my life, like a colourful, ravishing golden sunset. It was this elusive, mysterious, hairy humanoid that I chose to call Puffin that brought a smile to my face and laughter to my heart, and for that I will forever be grateful and indebted. Puffin taught me that life is indeed exquisitely beautiful, and that each new day is a precious gift of God, a brand new beginning, where the opportunities are boundless, and the secret to enjoying life is to embrace every single second with a thankful, grateful, and appreciative heart. In short, my husband tragically died in the 9/11 attack at the World Trade Center. This was when the Twin Towers came crashing down due to planes flying into the building, although many conspiracy theories abounded, suggesting that it was, in fact, a controlled demolition. Either way, and whatever you may believe, this tragic event brought the city of New York to its knees, and the rest of the world looking on in horror and in utter revulsion. It was an indelible footprint in American history that will never ever be forgotten, nor all the precious men and women that tragically lost their lives on that fateful day. They too will never ever be forgotten. Like so many of your listeners that were around at the time of the New York Twin Tower attacks, I always remember what I was doing on that fateful day, as invariably most people do. I remember that I got up at 6:30 a.m. that morning. That was much earlier than usual for me. I recall having butterflies in my stomach as I sensed that something was distinctly off. I could feel that it was going to be one of those less than favourable days, so to speak. I do not know how I sensed it, but I did. I often wonder how many other people had a gut feeling that things were going to go wrong on that day. My husband told me that he had a pounding headache that morning, and I tried to encourage him to take the day off, but he was so ethical and conscientious as far as his job was concerned, and after downing a couple of paracetamols, he kissed me on the cheek, told me he loved me, and that was the last time I ever actually saw him alive. It was at 7 a.m. when I decided to take my little Scottish terrier for a brisk walk, and when I came back half an hour later, I did feel invigorated and refreshed, but I still had this horrendous feeling in my gut that something very bad was about to happen. I'm not an intuitive person by any manner of means, but on this day something didn't feel right. I know all these years later that you need to listen to your gut, because believe me, it doesn't lie. I decided to distract myself by preparing the menu for a dinner party I was hosting the following Saturday evening for some of my husband's work colleagues. I remember my husband telling me that one of our dinner guests was a pescatarian, and I was not sure what that actually meant, so I called my husband. It must have been about 8:30 when I called him. At this time he was still in his office, and I asked him how his headache was, and he told me that it had thankfully gone. Then I asked him what pescatarian actually meant, and he told me that it meant that the person only eats fish. I proceeded to tell him how much I hated fish, but because of this punctilious, fastidious guest that was coming to dinner, I was now relegated to serving everybody fish. My husband assured me that I could just serve the pescatarian fish and everybody else something different. But what if all my guests secretly wish they have the fish when I serve them lamb instead, I said. Who in their right mind would favour sea bass over your tender, juicy lamb? Said my husband. I was getting heated. Yes, but supposing they really wish they were having the fish, I insisted. Well, then give them a choice, said my husband. Ask them what they would prefer to eat, sea bass or lamb. It's not that complicated, he said. You're a genius, I said. Well, I have to be, don't I, married to you, he said. It's pretty straightforward, I told you. What about pudding, I asked. Do you think I should do something fresh like lemon syllabub, or something sickly and sweet like sticky toffee pudding? Something sickly and sweet, said my husband. The men will appreciate a hearty English-style dessert. And besides, who in their right mind doesn't enjoy a sticky toffee pudding? I know it's Madonna's favourite. Before I could answer my husband, suddenly I heard this catastrophic clanging, walloping, banging and crashing sound, which to date was the most horrendous sound that I have ever heard in my life. In that instant my hair was standing on end, and my heart was starting to pound violently like a heavy drum, and I felt my whole body rattle and shake. Then I heard these terrifying screams, and I heard my husband's frantic voice saying, "Calm down, everybody, calm down. It's going to be all right. It's going to be all right. Calm down." "What's going on?" I cried at the other end of the line. "What's going on?" I could hear all these terrified shuffles and screams and people saying, "We're going to die, we're going to die." There were sobbing sounds, gasps, whimpers, howls and cries, and people going on about how scorchingly hot it was and how they couldn't breathe. It was like my biggest nightmare had come to life. "What's going on?" I cried at the other end of the line. "What's going on?" "I love you, babe," said my husband's solemn voice, picking up the phone. He was gasping for breath and was wheezing, heaving and choking as he spoke to me. Everything was happening so fast. "Something's happened. A plane has crashed into the building, and the place is filling with black smoke. It's almost impossible to breathe in here, and it's sweltering hot. I don't think we're going to make it. But don't forget that I love you. You're my world. Never forget that." "Please don't put the phone down. Please don't put the phone down," I sobbed. "I love you, babe," he said, choking. And those were his last words. I will never forget how I felt at that moment I heard the crash into the World Trade Center on the phone. And that memory will be imprinted on my life for all eternity. I cannot forget it. It is something you just can't forget. It was so hauntingly traumatic. I do consider myself to be one of the lucky ones to have actually spoken to my husband moments before his death, as many loved ones never got that chance. I was fortunate enough to tell my husband that I actually loved him. I did watch on the horrifying coverage on the television, but because my husband was struggling to breathe on the phone due to the black smoke, I knew immediately that he had not made it. In some ways, knowing that he had died was a lot better than all those people hanging on to the vain hope that their loved one had pulled through, only to discover later that they were well and truly gone. Not knowing has got to be the worst thing of all as far as I'm concerned, because it leaves you in a suspended state of helplessness and hope. This harrowing, unforgettable disaster was a moment that America was united by the most terrible grief that shook the fabric of our lives apart infinitely. America would be forever transformed by this compounding shared grief that touched the lives of every single living American and the entire world. Of that I am in no doubt. Fast forward a couple of weeks, and I was still in a dreadful emotional turmoil. I had lost so much weight that my cheeks were now sunken in and hollow. Food held no appeal to me whatsoever, and I did not really take much care with my appearance either. I just didn't care any more about anything or anyone, and getting up every morning was an arduous ordeal. I was suffering from a deep, heavy depression that just would not shift. The loss of my husband just filled me with the most devastating grief, and nothing I did made my life any happier. I had tried the grief counselling route, the church services, seeing friends and relatives, but nothing helped. I remember sinking emotionally into such a gloomy place of dreadful despondency that I just didn't want to go on living any more. I seriously considered downing a whole bunch of pills with a bottle of brandy and being done with this grievous, hostile world of ours. It just seemed like the world had become a dark, miserable place, and I had lost all faith and hope in humanity. How could there be such evil people out there who hated America so much that they wanted to tear our world apart like this, I wondered. I will say that there were times I did feel my husband's comforting presence around me, although I did tell myself it was wishful thinking. But now I'm almost certain my husband was revealing to me that he was still around. But in my overwhelming grief, it was so hard to perceive that that was even remotely possible. My favourite colour in the entire world is blue, and when my husband proposed to me 10 years earlier, he presented me with a bunch of blue flowers and a single blue balloon. One morning when taking my Scottish terrier Moggy for a walk, the most extraordinary thing happened. A young girl came up to me with a blue flower in her hand and said, "I wanted to give this to you." Then a short while later a blue balloon went floating past me, and I suddenly grabbed it. I felt sure it was from my husband. I really felt as if I could sense his presence. I know that sounds crazy, but I really did. That night when I went to bed, I had a very vivid, evocative dream. My husband was dressed all in white, and he stepped forward with a bunch of blue flowers and a blue balloon in his hand, and he had a big beam on his face, and he said, "You need to go to Tennessee. Leave tomorrow." Now, I want to stress that I knew nothing about Tennessee. Yes, I had fleetingly heard about the place, and I knew Dolly Parton came from that part of the world. I do recall there was a song, "My Tennessee Mountain Home," or something like that. I had lived in New York all my life and had never been to that part of America before. But the dream had been so lucid and so arresting that I was determined to listen to my husband's words, and so I booked a little cabin for myself for a couple of weeks to stay at the Tennessee countryside, and I decided to take Moggy with me, and off we both went. So there I was, staying in a sumptuously cosy, rather remote but very idyllic cabin in the Tennessee countryside, surrounded by glorious views overlooking majestic blue mountains, green undulated rolling hills, fields of pretty wild flowers, and areas of vast forest that literally stretched back for miles upon miles. For me personally, the icing on the cake was an exquisite silvery lake that was flanked on either side by a wooded area, and it was such a beautiful spot to watch the deer congregating to drink. Moggy was in his element, enjoying the fresh air, and everywhere he went, he would lift up his leg to leave a scent mark to tell the entire world that he'd been there. I have never seen my little Scottish terrier more exhilarated and more enthusiastic or exciting about anything before in his life. He looked like he'd died and gone to heaven, and practically insisted on rolling his back on every available piece of turf to extend his scent profile as far afield as was physically possible for him, to let every possible animal know that he had been there. It was like the countryside had made him deliriously drunk with happiness, and for the first time in ages I did manage a fleeting smile. I still remember the sunset that evening. It was more resplendent than anything I've ever seen in my entire life. I watched the whirling folds of yellows, tangerines and pinks moulding together in exquisite, alluring shades that quite literally took my breath away. In that moment I knew that I had done the right thing coming here to Tennessee. Maybe there was something healing and regenerating about this crisp mountain air after all. The following day I decided I'd take a walk to the Silvery Lake and then into the woods. I could not remember the last time I'd enjoyed some fresh air and exercise. I prepared myself a picnic lunch of a few ham and tomato sandwiches, crisps and some Mountain Dew, and a couple of bananas, and I wrapped up a nice juicy meaty bone for Moggy, and off we went on our walk. I do remember it was a radiantly beautiful day. The sun was shining. It wasn't too hot, just the way I liked it. As I walked, I admired the beauty of everything around me. Soon I approached the lake. Everything was reflected in the glistening surface of the water like a large mirror. I watched some wild ducks skimming across the surface, and I noticed a gorgeous fish-eagle on a branch looking over the water with his beady dark eyes. He did not fly away when he saw me, which I thought was incredibly amazing. He was magnificent and majestic. Moggy was sniffing the ground and wagging his tail and encouraging me to enter the wooded area close to the lake. I guess I did not require much persuasion, because I dutifully followed him. The woods were exquisite and were filled with white pines, oaks, dogwoods and maples. I guess you could say it was late summer, merging into autumn, so there was a little treefall on the ground, which was very pretty. And as I walked through the woods, I suddenly felt all the heaviness in my chest welling up to the surface like the bubbles in a pot of boiling water. The next thing I knew was that I started to sob and sob and sob. It had been 3 weeks, and I'd physically fought back those tears, but now I was sitting on the forest floor, sobbing my heart out like I've never cried before. Suddenly I heard the strange chattering sound, and I looked up through my tears to see what was making that peculiar noise. The only thing I could liken the noise to was that to the sound of a monkey, but I saw nothing. Moggy was wagging his tail at something and letting out some excited yaks, so I threw him his bone, which he started to chew with great gusto. The next thing I knew was that pretty blue flowers were being thrown at me, but where were they coming from? I did not know. Once again I looked around and saw nothing, but I kept hearing that strange chattering sound. I was sitting under a large oak tree, and I just so happened to look up, and there in the branches was a huge colossal creature, the likes of such that I have never seen before. At that time I'd never heard of Bigfoot because of living in New York. Creatures like that are not usually discussed. I could not make out what this creature actually was. It looked like it was half ape and half human, and this thing was monstrously huge, but he had such a cheerful, funny disposition. I was not afraid of him at all. The creature bounded out of the tree now that I'd seen him, and sat down several yards away from me, eyeing me curiously with a keen interest and intrigue. He was covered from head to toe with hazelnut hair, and he must have weighed about 600 pounds and been about 7 feet tall. Every part of his body rippled with dense muscle, and I do remember he had huge shoulders and a very distinct bullet-shaped head, with virtually no neck to speak of. His long face was a dark brown colour and looked like dark shiny leather, and he had a very distinct brow ridge, very flat nose, and sparkling brown eyes. I opened my ham sandwiches and threw him one. The creature discarded the bread and gobbled up the ham and tomato, and then began to mimic me. When I proceeded to eat my sandwich, he was so funny that I started choking on my sandwich, and I was laughing so much, and then he started imitating my choking, and then he started imitating all my laughing, which made me laugh all the more. I do not remember ever laughing this much. Pumped up by my enthusiasm, the creature decided to show off by swinging from one tree to another, giving me amazing display of his acrobatic prowess and his incredible agility. He did strange twists and turns that were so seamless that he would have made a ballet dancer appear clumsy. I began to clap, and then he imitated my clapping with an animated expression on his face. I was literally rolling on the forest floor, my stomach aching because I was laughing so much as his imitations of me were absolutely hilarious. The creature then began to throw some more blue flowers at me, like he would throw confetti at a bride. "How do you know I love blue?" I asked the creature, knowing full well the creature didn't understand my words, but he regarded me with very inquisitive eyes and chattered away jubilantly. He was so beautiful, and my heart was flooded with this incredible warmth. For the first time in ages I was feeling incredibly happy. I threw my packet of salted potato crisps at the creature. He played with the packet, tossing it up and down like a ball, catching it every time. He then threw it a fair distance away, and then began to catch it. He was so majestic, powerful, and agile, and was so beautiful to watch, because his movements were seamlessly graceful. After a while he opened the crisps, and after sniffing, examining, and tasting the crisps, he dived into them with an exuberant gusto, demolishing them all in a few seconds. He licked his chops appreciatively, and once the bag was empty, he put on an exaggerated, sad expression on his dark, leathery face, causing his wrinkles on his brow ridge to deepen significantly. He then showed me the empty bag, and he looked very, very sad. He surreptitiously pointed to my 2 bananas on the ground, and I threw them to him, and he munched them away eagerly with the skins on, observing me with an inquisitive curiosity all the while. I started to laugh. "You want more, don't you?" I said. "That's all I've got, but I'll bring you some more tomorrow." The creature gathered some of the blue flowers he had thrown at me and started to make a necklace out of flowers for me. "What?" I thought in shocked amazement. "How does this creature know about necklaces, let alone how to make them out of flowers?" I wondered. The creature worked with the flowers tirelessly, and I was amazed at his dexterity and nimbleness of his chubby sausage-sized fingers and huge monstrous hands. How was it possible to make something so delicate with such massive hands? He tossed the flowery necklace towards me and indicated for me to put it on my neck, which I did. It was so incredibly pretty. He made one for himself and a smaller one for Moggy. We were all now wearing blue flowery necklaces, but Moggy registered his displeasure by tearing his flowery collar to shreds in no time at all. I got up to leave the woods and waved to the creature. "See you in the morning," I said with a big smile on my face. That evening I ate a hearty meal, and for the first time in ages I felt as if the heaviness had dissipated. I did feel lighter and happier. Every day the hairy ape-like creature was in the woods waiting for me, and even Moggy, my dog, had grown attached to him. On this occasion I brought the creature a hairbrush, and to my amazement he absolutely adored being groomed. It took me about 3 long hours to brush out his long, tangled, human-like hair, but he chattered away happily while I did this, sometimes letting out a rather uncomfortable cry when I got to a tangled part of his hair. I guided the creature finally, once I'd finished, to the shimmering lake so that he could see his reflection in the water. I must admit his hair just gleamed in the midday sun, and the creature was amazed by how he looked. He studied his reflection closely and stroked his mane in awe, and he kept saying, "Oop, oop, oop," as if he just couldn't believe how fantastic he looked. He also let out a few happy whooping sounds, and then proceeded to brush his own hair all on his own, while admiring his reflection. I think he could not believe the transformation, and he loved his hairbrush. I also brought the creature a Rubik's cube, which I thought he might like, and I was not wrong. He loved it, and he understood the game immediately. I struggled to understand those cubes and to get those colours together, but this creature had absolutely no difficulty at all, and when he watched me struggling away with it, he was very puzzled that I found it at all challenging. Every time I went into the woods we played together, and as weird as it sounds, it felt as if I'd made the most amazing friend, because he really was such a special creature. One day we gathered some very late berries together. The hairy humanoid stuffed his mouth with the berries, and his face became very fat and puffy. When we went to relax under the oak tree, the creature emptied out his cheek pockets, much like a squirrel does, and proceeded to enjoy eating the berries one by one. It was really amusing to watch. I must admit it was with great sadness that I did finally have to leave Tennessee and say goodbye to my mountain friend, whom I've never ever forgotten, and remember with such a keen fondness. It was truly this awe-inspiring creature that brought me the light to my dark world, and hope to my hopelessness. And truly, if I had not met this creature, I doubt that I'd be here today to tell you my story. When I got back home to New York and did some research, I realized that Puffin was a Bigfoot. I also learnt that many people had experienced terrifying encounters with these creatures, and for them I'm truly sorry. But Puffin, he was an altogether different creature, a unique one, I'm in no doubt about that. I started dating a very nice gentleman that had very similar qualities to my late husband. One day he took me on a date, but arrived at my house with a huge bunch of blue flowers. Can you believe it? "How do you know I love blue flowers?" I asked him. "I didn't," he said. "I was actually buying you some red roses when there was a voice in my head that just told me, don't get her red roses, but get her those blue flowers instead. So that's what I did." I'm now happily married to this man today, and I have 2 beautiful children. So to all you listeners out there, don't get discouraged by the darkness and the hopelessness that you might be experiencing in your life right now. It all happens to us, but sooner or later the light will break through that darkness, because it did for me. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.